Okay, good evening ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to those attending and also to our viewers watching live on the Council's YouTube channel, Hillingdon, London. This is a meeting of the Residents' Education and Environmental Services Policy Overview Committee. And my name is Councillor Wayne Bridges and I'm the chairman of this meeting. The key role of this committee is to monitor the performance of local public services within its remit and to hold in-depth reviews on topics of resident interest. We engage with a range of external witnesses in our activity, which can include community groups, residents and subject matter experts. Where we identify areas for change or improvement, we make recommendations to the decision-making cabinet. Details of the business to be considered today is shown on the agenda, copies of which are available in the room and also accessible on YouTube underneath the broadcast. For those present in the room and intending to speak, please note that you will be filmed and any statements you make will be recorded and made public. And a reminder to councillors, officers and those speaking today that you should turn the microphone button on when speaking. This will ensure you can be heard in the room and by those watching online. Going round the table tonight, I'll introduce you to the people present. So on my right we have Councillor Steve Tuckwell, Councillor Debbie Radia, Councillor Paula Rodriguez, Councillor Alan Kaufman, Councillor Michael Markham, the Vice Chairman. To my left is the Clerk, Neil Fraser, Democratic Services. To my left, Councillor Jan Sweetin, the Labour Lead, and Councillor Stuart Mathers. Before we get on to the main agenda, some quick housekeeping rules. We're not expecting a fire alarm this evening. However, if one does sound, please follow officers to the fire exits and out of the building to the designated meeting point, which is the Civic Centre forecourt. Mobile devices to be placed on silent or switched off. And residents are welcome to give feedback about this meeting. Forms can be requested directly to the clerk or they are available under the broadcast online. With that said, we move on to apologies for absence, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies have been received from Councillor McWarner.
Thank you very much. Item 2, declarations of interest in matters coming before this meeting. Are there any? No. I can confirm that all business tonight will be discussed in part 1. And we move on to item 4, which is to agree the minutes of the previous meeting. Are there any comments or questions, or are we happy with those? Councillor Markham?
Yes, thank you. I noted item 6, the first paragraph, about minute 78. This question about 85-15 split in allocated funding for the repair of pavements in the north and south. The officers did make it quite clear that the reason for that split is because pavements in the north are worse than the pavements in the south. So I think it ought to be specified there to be accurate about the thing.
Any other members wishing to? Councillor Sweetin, did you indicate?
I'd just like to say that, in fact, it's been for the last 2 years the same split, exactly the same split, which does look rather awkward because there are... Anyway, I'm just saying that the split is a public record of the last 2 years.
Shall we agree to disagree, or would you like an officer to comment on that? Is that an option?
If I may, Chairman,
Councillor Malcolm.
I think it's quite right that pavements in the north have always been, certainly for the last few years, worse than pavements in the south. I just wanted to be accurate because it certainly isn't a political decision to make 85% in the north and 15%. Officers made it absolutely clear that it was based on the state of the pavements. That's all the only comment I'm making.
Okay, are we happy to note the minutes other than that? Okay, thank you very much. Item 5 is the gambling policy statement, and a very warm welcome to you, Stephanie. You'll be giving tonight's presentation, so whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman, and good evening, members. This is essentially part of the Council's policy framework underpinning the regulatory and enforcement activities that are undertaken under the Gambling Act 2005, regulating things like betting shops, fruit machines, arcades, that sort of activity. And we're required to review this policy every 3 years. Essentially, the previous policy has served us well. We're not proposing to make any major changes to that policy, but there has been some tidying up of some of the typos, changes of contacts and responsible authorities, that type of thing. So we are essentially now in the consultation period for that policy, and following the end of the consultation on the 8th of August, it will be referred back to Cabinet including any comments that are made, including by yourselves, and then it goes to full council for final adoption in November. I'm happy to take any questions that you may have on the specifics of the policy and the activities covered by it.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. I invite questions from members. Are there any? Councillor Mathers.
I just wondered if you could just frame for us the kind of methodology and how the review works. So I think for me, I know it's a revising because of legislation, etc., but is there an exercise within it to review to the best practice standards, to compare ourselves to other local authorities and to make sure that we're immersing ourselves in kind of the best practice nationally and not just revising things we have to through legislation?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. Yes, there absolutely is a process, and the things that we take into account are changes in legislation, changes in trends in the industry, and also any particular problems that we may have encountered during the term of the last policy. And I have to say that on reviewing all of those factors, there aren't any major significant changes that would kind of sway a major change in policy. We do consult with colleagues in responsible authorities, police, gambling commission, HMRC, and they are all quite satisfied that the policy works well in its current form, which is why we're not proposing major deviations from it.
Thank you. Councillor Mathers, do you have a supplementary you wish to ask?
I would be interested to know just what some of the more local challenges are. There may be none, they may be the same everywhere across the country, and what involvement the local charities and voluntary sector have had within that, as well as boards such as the Safeguarding Board.
Yeah, I can respond to that. We do have some issues in this borough. We have seen some issues in betting offices, ASB crime associated with betting offices. There is another side to betting offices in the potential addiction that can come with that, particularly for vulnerable persons around the borough. And we do receive information from GamCare. We work closely with the police who operate certain schemes such as BetWatch, which operates self-exclusion. We find that over-the-counter betting isn't so much the issue, but it's more the machines in the betting offices that tend to be the real hook for people. So we do work very closely with partner charities. We work with like I said, GamCare, GamStop, and make sure all the correct literature is displayed. My licensing officers will go out and do that as part of their routine checks, and also with in joint liaison with the Gambling Commission enforcement officers, we will work with big operators, small operators, where they may be making failings in those areas. It is a condition of their licences to have the literature displayed for those self-help kind of groups, so we do check those.
Thank you. Councillor Swain.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to have clarification on page 14, 1.9, because it seems to assume that the consultation is complete. It does say that the consultation process and the comments can be seen on the council's website. Well, seeing that the consultation doesn't end until the 8th, I don't think that's actually now possible.
Thank you. Quite right. This is clearly a throwback to the previous policy, so that the paragraph will be rephrased at the end of the consultation to take into account the new dates.
And my follow-up would be from page 31, paragraph 4.7, and it talks about conducting local area profiles. So have we conducted any local area profiles, and are we taking into account future emerging risks from, say, high density flats, increased populations, Hayes becoming an urban area and not a suburban area, and same for West Drayton. So we've got a changing dynamic here with our population, and so I was wondering if we had in fact undertaken any of these local area profiles.
We have not undertaken any formal local area profiles, and we do not have at the moment a profile under which applicants can assess their applications. What we do require under the Act is for applicants to actually make their own risk assessments, taking into account the local demographics, particularly when we're opening up, when they're applying for new premises. What I would say is that the current trend in gambling premises, particularly with betting shops. They're actually on the decline. So we saw a big boom of lots of them opening after the Act came in 2007. And over I'd say the last year to 2 years, we have started to see one by one a bit of a decline in numbers. And we're expecting this decline to continue and even accelerate over the next year, because there has been a change in legislation which affects the high stake machines that are available in gambling premises, betting shops. So we are actually expecting more closures than we are any new premises opening. But in answer to your question, no, we do not have formal local area profiles.
Thank you. Councillor Markham.
Thank you, Chairman. Am I right in thinking that every local authority in England and Wales is also carrying out a similar review?
Yes, they all kind of time at the same kind of time. So 2019 sees all local authorities renew their policies. And
in your experience, the issues that you've just outlined relevant to Hillingdon are common to every other local authority?
Yes, I'd say that perhaps local authorities up and down the country have hotspots of betting offices, and the typical type of issues that we see with betting offices, I would qualify that by saying in certain areas only. It's not a complete across-the-board issue, but in certain hotspots, yes, I would imagine that certainly colleagues in London, my counterparts in the London boroughs, would see very much the same issues.
Thank you very much. Councillor Tuckwell.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for sharing this report with us. Just an observation, really, and looking at the protecting children and other vulnerable persons. It's good to see that we've got some provision in here to sort of support people with mental impairments. Who, as it says here, not able to make informed or balanced decisions. Just wondered if you can maybe talk to us a little bit more about how that works.
So the industry, the Gambling Commission, will produce guidance for the operators to comply with, and in there it will have quite a robust set of policies that would relate to the protection of children and vulnerable persons, and it would include things like the training that is required for staff, and the certain questions and signs that staff will have to spot if somebody is vulnerable or underage even. So we will check that as part of our compliance checks on betting offices and checks on the conditions. We will also check their package of what the umbrella that we call social responsibility, and under that will be how they safeguard against vulnerable people. We will ask to see their self-exclusion registers, perhaps complaints. We have come across situations where family members have made complaints to betting offices asking for a certain person to be refused. So we do come across these things, and they are all checked as part of our kind of social responsibility checks that we carry out in partnership with the Gambling Commission as well.
Okay. Thank you. Do you have a follow-up, Councillor Tuckwell?
Yeah, just again on page 60, the schedule of consultees to the draft policy. I mean, how does that work in terms of these vast array of, I think it's charities and establishments across the borough? So how does that work? Because there's quite a few that link into what you've just said there around sort of like Hillingdon Mind and the Samaritans. And I'm thinking, with another hat on as mental health champion for the borough, what kind of things we would expect to sort of see by way of consultation for these groups.
As part of the consultation, how we do it, we obtain email addresses for all of these organisations, and we email them, and we provide them with the policy document. We invite any comments. It can relate to anything or any questions. So that's really how we invite persons to partake in that consultation. We are required by law to consult with both the trade and also the regulators and also the charity arm as well. So we are required to consult with quite a few different groups, all having a stake in the gambling industry.
Councillor Vardia.
Thank you, Chairman. So I know that as a local authority, if we are concerned about a specific gambling establishment, we have to report that to the Gambling Commission. And what I'm trying to understand is if there's that two-way relationship. So if the Gambling Commission have had sort of concerns brought to their attention about the operational side, of a gambling institution, would they then feed that back to you? Because in the report it was presented as a one-way dialogue, and I just want to know whether in practice there is more of a two-way dialogue. And do I ask the follow-up question?
You may, if you wish.
Thank you. And I was quite surprised to see you include a list of considerations that you make when deciding upon where one of these places is located. You cite schools, vulnerable people and children, young people and places of worship. But I would have expected the list to be a little bit longer, and I wanted to know again whether it is just limited to that, or whether you look at things, for example, the proximity to alcohol establishments, or whether there already are plenty of gambling establishments in the vicinity, and also crime.
Thank you. I'll address your first question, which was the relationship between the Gambling Commission and the local authority. The split for regulating the gambling industry is the Gambling Commission will regulate the operators, so they will operate the big operators. We operate the premises. So the Gambling Commission look after the big operators and their national profile, and also online betting and online gaming. We regulate the premises. So that's just to explain how it's split in nationally. The Gambling Commission have their own scheme of proactive enforcement and response. So they will, if it's an operational issue, a sort of high-level operational issue, they will look into that and they will provide us with the information. Likewise, if we go to a premises and we are faced with certain issues that we would benefit from their input, we will share that information as well. And the actual structure of the Gambling Commission, they have patches. So West London is covered by an enforcement, a dedicated Gambling Commission officer, and we're in regular contact with that person to ensure that our patch, we've got that flow of information to and from. Your second point, which was on the type of environment that we would take into account with placing new offices or gambling premises, would be the list is not exhaustive. It's just some examples of things that we may consider. We are quite restricted under the gambling powers because they are permissive, and the Gambling Act tells us that we have to aim to permit gambling establishments, unless there is a really, really good reason and an evidenced reason as to why not. The local authority is aiming to permit gambling facilities. Rightly or wrongly, we have our own opinions on that, but that is what the legislation gives us. So whilst that list is not exhaustive, we can take into account anything that may affect the principle of regulating that particular premises.
Councillor Swain.
Thank you, Chair. The Council has a relatively new duty of care to look after children up to the age of 25. So has this policy been changed in any way to meet those requirements of this very vulnerable group of youngsters and the possibility that they are going to be using gambling premises?
No, not specifically in relation to that new power. What I would suggest is that we do have safeguards in the policy for children and vulnerable adults. And I'd suggest that anybody between 18 to 25 would legally be classed as a vulnerable adult. And if the measures are not suitable enough for those particular young adults, then I would welcome further comments as to how we could make improvements on that within the policy.
Councillor Swain.
Do we have any comments from the Hillingdon Local Safeguarding Children's Board as yet to this policy?
Not as yet, no.
Can I just make another comment?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
I'm Secretary of the
Could you use your microphone?
Association, and I haven't received any consultation information on this. I don't know why.
I will check that for you. Which particular residents association?
The Garden City Estate Residents Association.
Leave that with me, Councillor. I'll check that for you.
Thank you very much. I've got no other members wishing to ask questions or comments, so I assume we've run out of questions to ask. So are we happy to note the reports?
Agreed.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Stephanie, for your attendance. You're free to go whenever you wish. Thank you. Item 6, pages 65 to 70, are the emergency response processes. And we have Debbie with us this evening. A very warm welcome to you, Debbie. And you'll be giving the presentation on this item, so whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bridges, and thank you for inviting me to the committee meeting this evening. Wasn't particularly sort of going to go through my report in any great detail. What I wanted to do was just sort of flesh out a couple of issues, but I wanted to make it more available, the time available for any questions that you might have. I suppose really just to note the sort of the content really of the report, but I think particularly what I wanted to draw on was the new structure, the command and control structure within the organisation that we've had to adopt, and it's very much part of the standardisation process across all of the London boroughs, and that's to ensure that there is consistency in the approach, particularly for large-scale events, and if we require mutual aid from other councils, from other council staff to come in, then because we've all got the same structure, the same command and control structure, then it's easier to sort of fit people into those roles, and then vice versa. If we need to support another borough, then again the structure is exactly the same. But I think particularly the sort of to note on here, without taking anyone's eyes out, particularly is the relationship between obviously members and the chief exec and sort of council gold, and very much the sort of that liaison with an incident that's occurred within the borough, then it would be very much through the sort of the communication channel with the chief executive and the leader. So if anything is happening in your ward, then that would be the process to follow. And my sense really is that it's tempting, as I know it is, for people to sort of be drawn towards the incident scene. The other particular issue, of course, is our residents, and it's wherever our residents have been evacuated to or moved to a place of safety. And again, it's making sure that you are aware as ward members, if anything happened in your wards, that sort of, you know, the best place for you really is working obviously, you know, very much we'd be able to advise you where the rest centres have been set up locally or that where the residents have been taken to. So that was really just to explain the structure, and it's very much the sort of council gold level is sort of directors and heads of service, senior heads of service. The council silver is very much sort of senior council officers, senior managers, and then we've sort of got emergency response officers who are part of a core group of volunteers. They volunteer to become emergency response officers, and happily we do have a few, which is helpful, and they take the positions within the BEC, which is the Borough Emergency Control Centre, and then one of them is activated both in hours and out of hours for incidents that occur, and they will be deployed to the scene at the request of either the fire brigade or the Met Police service. So that was really just, I mentioned it within the report, but I just thought it would be helpful just to sort of put a sort of the diagram of what the command and control structure looks like for you. And then the other thing I just wanted to sort of briefly bring to your attention, I know that a request was made for sort of more information about flooding and flood defences, and it's something that I mentioned in the report. And again, it was just really just to give you an idea of the other options that are available for flood barriers. This is something that the Environment Agency use. I was at the Emergency Services Show in September last year, and came across them, and I got quite excited, I must confess. And I thought I would, if ever an opportunity arose to share my excitement with you, so I thought I would. But other than sharing, you know, this is an alternative to sandbags, and of course there's nothing worse than having a wet, soggy sandbag, and if they split, you've got sand everywhere, and it's not particularly hygienic. So this is, as I say, it's just an alternative option that, as I say, the Environment Agency are using, and it's, you know, if a more robust response was required. And that was the main points that I wanted to sort of tease out from my report. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Debbie. I now invite members' questions. So Councillor Markham will start with.
Just to clarify, our role as ward councillors is really to sort of hold the hands of residents. We are not involved in any decision making. We are not part of the command central unit. It is simply to do with our residents where they have been relocated to. Is that right?
Yes, it is, Councillor Markham. Thank you for your question. Yes, predominantly because of your rapport and your working relationship that you have with our residents. You know the residents better than we as officers do. So you're in a very sort of valuable position. And it's also basically to assess the needs of the residents. But there are other roles that councillors do have in response to a major incident. I won't go into them now, mercifully and thankfully, you'll be pleased to know. But again, within the report, that's why I wanted to mention that there is a member training. Pilot courses have been rolled out last month and this month, and again September, October time. And once those pilot training courses have been completed, then they'll be available to us as a local authority to roll out the training within the council, so that yes, it's very much sort of providing you with more information about your important role that you have with our residents in response to a major incident.
Thank you. Could I just say the second point? I noticed that the council's participating in 2 control of major accident hazards exercises in October and November. Presumably they're the first exercises under the new structure. The reason I ask is that I think it would be quite useful for us to have an idea, did it work? Yes. So would that be possible for a briefing note?
Absolutely, yes. The control of major accident hazards has been. They have tabletop exercises or live exercises once every 3 years. So this is the sort of the 3-year cycle. But yes, certainly, of course, I will provide a report to the committee following both of those exercises. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Councillor Kaufman.
Thank you, Chairman. The visuals we see on the screen, Debbie, are they permanent, or are they able to be sort of taken down once the flood has diminished? And if you look at those, how quick is it to get those up, vis-a-vis, versus sandbags with groups of people standing in line pushing the sandbags down?
Thank you very much for your question, Councillor. I'm trying to remember what your first question was now. No, they're not. They're not meant to be a permanent design or part of the street furniture within the council. They are sort of temporary structures, if you like. So they're deployable just in the response to a flooding incident, and then when the water levels subside to near normal levels or the normal level, then they can be removed. Yes, but of course it's purely up to yourselves if you want to leave them there permanently. How quickly they are deployable is an extremely good question, and the honest answer is I'm not terribly sure, because I've not seen them in action as they were. I've just seen an inert display of a few put together, but I've not actually been to a response where they have been deployed and they've been put together. I would imagine that some training would be required for council officers to deploy.
Councillor Kaufman, do you have a follow-up? Use your mic, please.
What about the cost implications, sandbags versus...
Clearly there are cost implications, because I would imagine that these are slightly more expensive than the sandbags. But I would say that in their defence, that they are more durable and more robust, and they will last a little bit longer. One of the things, though, just a sort of caveat, sort of putting these up and sort of bringing this to your attention, is that I haven't sort of gone any further, other than merely to sort of show you, there are alternatives to sandbags, and therefore I haven't actually costed how much barriers of this nature would cost. I didn't want to sort of go too far down the route and get too carried away. I just merely wanted to sort of just highlight that, you know, it is something that certainly the Environment Agency are using as their best practice, but it was just really to bring these to your attention, but I haven't done anything more substantial than that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Swain.
Well, thank you very much for this detailed report. It's very welcomed, and I think we can all see where it's all come from, the tragedies of the Grenfell, etc. All councils have got to tighten up and make certain that we are well prepared for ourselves and our residents. I would very much welcome the information that you've provided on the sort of the family tree of responders and individual information that would be useful for councillors. I mean, you mentioned quite a few things in the report, including the plan that was ratified probably yesterday by the corporate management team. It says July the 17th, so presumably that went through. Can we see a copy of that? I mean, more information that we get, we realise that we've only got a small part of the operation here as ward councillors, but the more we know, the more we can help our residents to be prepared themselves and to make certain that they are not worried about these events that do occur, fires do occur in the borough. So, I mean, I was surprised about the amount of information there was here, and certainly about the exercises that have taken place that I had no knowledge of. So the more information you can give us as councillors so that we can cascade that out to our residents, the better, please.
Yep.
Thank you, Councillor Sweeting, and thank you for your comments on the report. I'm always happy to keep members updated. What I didn't want to do was sort of overwhelm you or bombard you with information, so quite happy to do that. I think, and you may raise a good point actually. I was due to go to the corporate management team yesterday with the emergency shelters plans. Unfortunately, we had a real incident to respond to a couple of weeks ago, and so my focus of attention was sort of plugging the holes that we had within our response as a result of that, and it was sort of brought forward, and so sadly I ran out of time. But the corporate management team, I'm due to go back in September with the plans that have been ratified, and as soon as they are ratified, then I will share them with Democratic Services, with Mr. Fraser, and so that they will be available to you.
Councillor Sweeting.
Can I bring your attention to page 70 and the list of incidents? What we do not see there are two very large incidences. The one that was on the 28th of April, and that was on the coal yard site in Useley, where there was a massive fire that could actually be seen from Heathrow Airport. And I was there, I actually reported the incident. My ward is not Useley ward, obviously, but we're within 50 metres of Useley ward, and there were residents sort of looking at this plume of smoke, but also cylinders exploding. Now, this incident has, Jean Palmer, the Deputy Chief Executive, has been involved in this, and so has the Environment Agency been involved in it, and yet it's not listed. It's the biggest incident. And can I also say that I reported it, but I asked for an update. And when I went through again to the reporting people, people I reported it to, they refused to give me an update. Now, I know it wasn't in my ward, but the cylinders were still exploding and going into the air. And so I didn't take this further, but I would say that even though we're only supposed to be dealing with our own wards, when you have got an incident that is affecting the neighbouring ward, all of the councillors need to be kept up to speed with that.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you, Councillor Sweeting, for your question. I couldn't list all of the incidents that have occurred within the borough. The ones that I have listed are the ones that involve the activation of either the emergency response officers, the local authority liaison officer, and our Council Gold, Council Silver, and the BEC, and myself. And that incident that you mentioned on the 28th of April, yes, it was I believe it was a Sunday, yes, we noticed it, but neither the fire brigade nor the Metropolitan Police, they didn't alert us initially. They only activated the local authority liaison officer when it was felt, as I think it took them 3 hours to extinguish the fire. And by the time that our liaison officer had arrived on the scene, the fire had been put out. We would only be involved if they needed our assistance with evacuating residents. As far as I'm aware from that incident, nobody was evacuated. We had staff on standby, so we had our adult social care teams and social services were on standby just in case, because there were our residents, some of the residents were vulnerable, classified as vulnerable. So we were very mindful that we had mechanisms in place to take people to safety where it required. But if we're not fully, I only mentioned the ones that we were fully activated, and that one we were aware of, but we didn't need to activate our corporate emergency response plan in response to that incident because it was very much a fire and Met Police issue, so not one for the council.
Thank you. Before I go on to the next member's question, I believe the Vice Chairman wanted to ask a question that was relevant to what Council...
Yeah, if I may, I mean, you made it absolutely clear what our role is as ward councillors, but I want to take up what Councillor Sweeting has said about need to know and what we need to know. And I'd like to know whether there is a liaison officer as part of your command structure, whether there is somebody whose role is to keep ward councillors involved. And I think also, I take her point, that it's not necessarily the councillors who are responsible for that particular ward, because major incidents, by their very nature, affect a number of wards. So my key question is, is there a liaison officer whose role is to keep local councillors up to date and up to speed with what is going on?
Thank you, Councillor Markham, for your question. The short answer is yes. How that is basically facilitated is very much through the Chief Executive and the leader, through Council Gold. So that is at a very strategic level for members. The issue about information, that we are very reliant on information that comes through from both the Met Police Service and the London Fire Brigade, which initially is very, very sketchy, it's very patchy, it's very imprecise, and we can only really rely on information that's provided to us. As soon as we have information, then we do provide briefing notes to the leader so that it can be shared accordingly. But if we don't give you the information, it's not that we can't give it to you, it's because we don't have it either. So we are not necessarily involved in the direct information process necessarily with the police. It just depends on the size, the scale of the incident and the impact that it has on the council and on our residents. And sometimes, again, with the fire brigade, I've discovered that while they are not certain as to the cause of an incident, then they won't share the reports with us. As soon as they're able to share the reports with us, then I am able to receive them. But I wasn't aware that you would also like to see them. But now that I know, then I can make them available to you moving forward.
Councillor Swain, I know you indicated, but you had a follow-up beforehand. There's two other members who speak. If I can come back to you after that, if you're happy to. Okay. Councillor Tuckwell.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, again, I echo the sentiment about this is a huge subject, and how you've got it into sort of like, a few pages is beyond astonishing, actually, so well done on that one. I'd like to just pick up, again, it's great to see the training plan in place, and you covered that off, so that was one of my points I wanted to raise. But again, the four incidents that we have touched on, but what I'd like to just explore is any common learning themes that have come out from those incidents that can be sort of taken forward, so hopefully not any incidents in the future, but we are where we are. So is there any common learning themes that have come out of those incidents?
And thank you, Councillor Tuckwell, for your question. Yes, each incident, the nature of emergency planning and the response, that no two incidents are the same. And as a result of that, yes, each one provides an opportunity to learn and improve our response. I make this next comment carefully and cautiously, but so far, I mean, I joined the council in March last year, and we've had a number of relatively small incidents and events that we have had to respond to, which have provided really, really useful learning. I mean, they do say that no plan survives first contact with an incident, and it does give an opportunity for us to review our plans. I've reviewed the corporate emergency response plan accordingly as a result of a number of the incidents that we experienced last year to make the response more robust, but it is something that continually is it's like painting the Forth Road Bridge. It's a continuous process. One of the things I would say, the most recent incident that we responded to on the 29th of June and the 1st of July raised some interesting learning points in relation to how we would activate our emergency centres. And the plans have been rewritten. And ideally you want to test the plan again before a real incident. So that's something that we are looking at. It's certainly my next thing that I'm focusing on. And so those plans will be reviewed and hopefully ratified by the corporate management team in September. But again, if it helps, I'm in the process of writing the debrief report following the fire on the 29th of June. And if members so wish, then I can share the report with you if that would be helpful.
Thank you. Councillor Tuckwell, do you have a follow-up?
It's not a question, it's just it's reassuring to hear your comments that we're continually learning and improving as we go. So no, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Mathers.
Thank you. So recently, not recently, but the Cabinet's approved the Local Plan Part 2, which for the south of the borough continues to change it in terms of its density of housing. Already we're seeing, as you'll see from the incidents, much more high-rise building, very high packed residential areas near, quite busy high streets, etc., etc. And I believe since I was last on the fringes of I don't know if you call them major or minor or not, but an incident previous summer, I think there has been strides after a block of flats that was being built went up. But I think it's for me, it's the information that would be most useful to councillors in the south of the borough, and not all areas generally, is just how we're not stress testing, because that's happening, but just the contingencies, the resilience that's being reviewed and put in place, the activities that's focusing particularly on a change in borough, so that we're not always responding to what's been, but looking ahead to what will be. Every month a pub in West Drayton turns into a block of flats, and the next block of flats gets higher than the previous, etc., etc., etc. I'm just concerned that if we just focus on what's been, that and I'm sure you're not, but just the kind of what next.
Councillor Mathers, thank you very much for your points and for your question. One of the things that the council does have is a risk register, and that's something that we look at with our partners, our multi-agency partners on the Hillingdon Resilience Forum as well, and so that we are forward-looking. Yes, it's useful to sort of learn the lessons from previous incidents, but yes, it's very much a dual process. But yes, it is constantly looking at risks in the future which could affect the borough and which may cause a major incident, and then how we would mitigate that and how we would respond. So it's constantly sort of horizon scanning, and I live on the dark side, so this is my comfort area. So I'm always constantly looking for things to go wrong, so that they can be assessed on that risk register. But it's a borough-wide risk register that we look at with multi-agency partners.
Do you have a follow-up, Councillor Mathers?
So I suppose my thinking is, again with the councillor role as well, the kind of aftercare and the messaging. So what I did find during any incident now is that Facebook tells you as quickly as anything else probably quicker than the police and fire service may inform yourselves. And that means that I'm getting inundated when anything happens, particularly around a fire in a block of flats, with Facebook messages and tweets, etc. And I have confidence that the structure works in trying to get the information down, but what would be useful is just if we could look at ways in which there could be support from the council's comms and individual councillors. I know that we're not bound by the same rules in that sense, but just individual councillors who are getting requests, just an easy way to feed it in without getting stuck at the door. During the incident that I was on the fringes of, it was small things like residents, the high street was, if you block any high street between, I suppose, West Drayton and Uxbridge, everything comes to a standstill for 6 wards. And I suppose for me it was just that how we communicate, don't go this way, sort of very simple things, or that actually a local council car park for those who can't get to their house because of a fire incident could be made free that evening. And I rang that through the front door because I was a bit of a new councillor and wasn't sure that, of the leader's involvement. But I am concerned that actually just that practical advice that reassures residents in the immediate, that little bit after, and then kind of afterwards they can go, actually, no, I know the council's now responding, that if the same thing happened next week, that this is the response, or I know there are local centres in place, just those kind of reassuring messages in partnership with local councillors. So I wondered if that could be looked at as well as part of the wider package of reviewing incidents.
Again, thank you very much for your question. One of the things that I do within the Emergency Management and Response Service is work very closely with our corporate communications and very much providing the reassurance and the information to the residents, particularly in relation to any road closures, any obstructions, and particularly in advising the residents where they need to go and how to avoid any areas, and particularly again if they've been evacuated, and where the places to go to are, where the rest centres are, and particularly if we have an indication as to depending on the situation how long they could be out of their homes for, and it's very much we're working very closely with communications very much in order to sort of make that much more robust. And that information is provided through social media, but equally through the website, and again through briefing notes to the leader, which again can be cascaded to the councillors and also to the residents. So we're looking at having much more of a proactive stance in messaging, because again it's one of the things that we need to do under the Civil Contingencies Act of 2004 is to warn, inform and advise the public and of course our residents as to how their homes or their area their neighbourhood has been affected by a disaster.
Thank you very much. Councillor Swain, would you like to resume with your earlier comments?
Yes, thank you. Can we go back to flooding, please? That's the third paragraph on page 67. Now, we talk about sandbags. Now, the incidents that I've attended of flooding, and I remember them very well because the Wellington boots had to come out, sandbags were not going to stop certain incidents of flooding. And so I would like the word could to be changed to would, because I do think we do need to have further consideration of providing a more robust solution to flooding problems, and especially with the worry about global warming and the incidences of changes in temperature and changes in weather patterns. So at the moment it says, within the borough, consideration could be given to having a more robust, maybe will or should, would be better if possible.
Debbie, would you like to comment?
Comments, please.
Well, I suppose I was. Well, thank you very much for that. I suppose I was being quite cautious. But yes, I was trying to be quite careful. I didn't want to be too gung ho, and trying to sort of influence people overly, with a more robust response. But if it's the will of the committee, that I changed the wording, so it was merely done as a sort of as a suggestion, as an option for you, without sort of committing you to doing anything more responsive. It was really, that's hence, my rationale for sort of saying, well, its consideration could be if it was, within or so wished. I didn't want to be, as I say, too descriptive or too prescriptive, rather.
Thank you very much. For members' information, really, it's not down to us as a committee to make these sort of financial decisions. This is purely an information item. However, I believe the clerk has noted the comments and it will be available in the minutes. Perhaps you could feed that back to the relevant cabinet member who could look in that in further detail if you wish to do so. Councillor Swain, did you have a follow-up before I move on?
Well, only just that, flooding is occurring not only in my ward, but in many wards, I'm sure, in other parts of the borough. So it's something that we're all very, careful with our residents, making certain that, we are as robust as we possibly can be, recognising that there is a financial element to this that will have to be considered by the council.
Thank you. Councillor Kaufman.
Thank you, Chairman. Debbie, it might be an idea if we, or if you've got some costings on this new system, and in comparison with sandbags, etc., which would probably answer Councillor Sweeting's question as well as mine, going forward with flood protection.
As was mentioned earlier, it's not for this committee to make any financial decisions. We have noted it in our minutes. I'm sure the officer, Debbie, will take the feedback to both her colleagues and the cabinet as well, and we'll see how we progress with it going forward. Okay. I think we've exhausted most of the questions now on flooding and every emergency going now, so I think we're well prepared at this point. So without there being any further questions, I'll thank you, Debbie, for your attendance this evening. Very much appreciated. And you're free to leave whenever you feel the need to do so. Item 7 is our budget planning report for resident services, and welcome to you, Ian, again. You're a regular on this committee, so whenever you're ready, you know what to do. Cheers.
Cool. Thank you, Chairman. Yes. As you mentioned, this is the first of our 2 annual regular appearances from finance at the committee. The council, as ever, runs the budget planning cycle throughout the full year. So, although we formally set council tax in February, this is a year-round process, gearing up, working out what budgets look like going forward. The report that's been presented to you today is purely setting out the context in which the council is effectively making its budget recommendations for the forthcoming year. Specific budget proposals will be brought back to the committee in January, and those will reflect the decisions that Cabinet take in December, in effect setting out the draft budget for public consultation and for consultation with the committees, anyone else who has minded to sort of feed into that process. So following those consultations following the meeting in January, feedback from the committee will then be fed into the papers that Cabinet and Council are considering when they set the final budget at that point. The only other point I just wanted to sort of highlight within the report is the overall budget gap over the next 3 years, and effectively what the 3 main building blocks are of that gap. And then I was going to sort of hand the floor back to questions if that's the way to phrase that. So we are projecting in line with the position which we had back in February 2019 and was set out in the Cabinet's budget papers for the year, a £28 million budget gap over the coming 3 years. This is consistent with what we've seen in recent years, and sort of it mirrors that is being seen by most other local authorities, if not all other local authorities. That budget gap is based on the assumption that there is an inflationary increase in council tax over that period. And the key drivers behind it are there's around £12 million, which reflects the inflationary and sort of demand-led, so i.e. population growth in the borough, increase in the cost of services. So it's around £12 million over the next 3 years is what it would cost us to provide the same services to the borough. There's around £9 million that gap is driven by the financing for the council's investment in capital. So that includes a number of things, including school places. As a segue to the next item on the agenda. And the final element is we have £8 million, which are effectively savings deferred from previous years as part of the budget strategy. So together those give us our 28 million, and that's the figure that we're looking to manage over the next 3 years.
Thank you very much, Ian. I'll start with any questions from members. Before I do so, for the benefit of those watching online, I welcome to Mr. Little, who's joined us this evening as the education representative and will be here for education items on the agenda. Any questions from members, please? Councillor Sweetin.
Thank you, Chair. We realise that it's going to be a very challenging time next year, but obviously there's been discussions already on the areas that council officers are looking at. So could you give us some indication of the direction of travel the council is considering in respect of reducing budgets in the areas where this POC is responsible? You know, there's quite a lot of detail about emerging budgets, pressures for SEN transport, for example. There's also the issue of youth services, which there's going to be a report on that. I know you can't give us any detail because there's still discussions going on, but it's all very well to have this report, but I think if you can provide us with any direction of travel that the council is going and what areas are likely under this policy committee are being looked at, that would be useful at this stage.
Yes, so at paragraph 18 in the report, we set out the council, or the approach we take internally to developing savings proposals is broadly structured around six themes. The largest of these, in terms of the value it's delivered in recent years, and we'd expect it to be going forward, is looking at its service transformation. So effectively, this is about us looking at how we can do things more efficiently, how we can adapt the way we run the council to meet changing needs. So that would be sort of potentially things like continuation of, so there are, we have coming out of the bid programme a broad range of activity which is being undertaken across the council. I suppose it's tricky in terms of within the specific remit of the policy overview committee. I suppose if it's not too sort of vague an answer, but almost every service is reviewed as part of the annual budget setting process. So at the moment we're looking, you know, broadly at the potential options that are out there. The other areas that I would just sort of draw attention to in that list are, we've got the opportunity to look at zero-based budgeting. So every year we will make sure that the budgets we've got are still being used to deliver the services that are required today. So that over time gives us a fair amount of flexibility in that we effectively can redirect funding to meet those growing areas of demand. Reviewing all our procurement, ensuring we're securing value for money remains an area of focus. We have a savings theme in here, which is branded commercialisation and maximising income. That's just making sure that we are looking at where the council does have charging powers, where there are opportunities. So things like, I don't know, so we have investment in the new housing company that the council has, making sure that where we've got these opportunities, we can take them, and that can be fed into the budget strategy.
Thank you. Councillor Sweetin, do you have a follow-up question?
I do, thank you, Chair. I'm looking at page 72, paragraph 9, and reading it as a non-finance person, it says the 142,949,000 capital investment is basically without a specific financing strategy. Now, what does that actually mean, please? Because reading it, saying that without a specific financing strategy is quite a worrying statement, I would have thought, in the light of that amount of money that we're borrowing.
Ian?
Yes, thank you for the question. So the £143 million of investment there, that's referring to those schemes where the individual capital scheme itself doesn't pay for itself. So that would be something like the upgrade of lighting in the Civic Centre to be LED lighting. It's something that we will spend money and will incur costs, will borrow money, but the costs of repaying that borrowing will be more than offset by the reduction in energy spending on running those light bulbs once they're LEDs. When we talk about items without a specific financing strategy, this is where we're investing in service provision. So where we are to again to come back to school place planning. When we deliver school places, those places obviously do not in and of themselves generate a revenue stream that funds the initial capital investment. However, that does provide a vital service to residents. So in order to manage the costs of financing that kind of investment, that fits into the broader budget strategy. So I suppose just to draw attention that not everything in our capital programme hits the bottom line in that sense, as it funds itself, but there is £143 million worth of investment, which if that number was lower, it would reduce the savings requirement.
Thank you. Mr. Little? Could you use your microphone, Mr. Little, please? Thank you.
I want to refer to paragraph 15 on the high needs element of the school budgets. And it says that this has been a problem and how it's been dealt with up till now. And I would like to ask a three-part question. One is the demand still growing for this high needs spending? Secondly, there has been a cumulative deficit on this. Do we have a strategy for eliminating the accumulated deficit? And thirdly, on the basis that there is a continuing problem, is it the intention that more money will be transferred from schools to fund this next year?
Thank you, Ian.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. So running through in terms of yes, we are anticipating further growth in spend on high needs over the next few years. It's what we're seeing is effectively the changes that came through the 2014 Act have effectively amplified sort of existing trends of growth in the population. Obviously, anything where it's to do with changing of, I suppose, the threshold whereby that spend is being incurred will have an end point. But I think in looking at the context of the next 3 years and setting budgets, we'd expect to continue to see rises in the cost of SEN education. Moving on to the second point. So the £10 million cumulative deficit is the council and schools forum have prepared a deficit recovery plan, which sets out an attempt to bring down the in-year deficit, effectively a way to bring that back into balance over the longer term. At present, there isn't a specific answer, I'd say, either in Hillingdon or nationally as to what we do with the cumulative deficits. Although the £10 million obviously is a large number, that's part of a national issue, which I think is definitely getting an airing in terms of in the national political debate, and the future funding for high needs is definitely on the agenda. So we'd expect the longer term solution to this anticipate would include some level of additional government support for high needs, which would expect to contribute towards this. In terms of specific measures around looking at schools, a contribution to the balance between the high needs element of the budget and that going to individual schools, at this point in the budget setting cycle, we haven't got that sort of. That would be a decision for between sort of schools forum and that sort of budget setting process later in the year. Once we get to that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Little. Do you have a follow up at all? Okay. Thank you. Councillor Mathers?
Thank you. You spoke about the uplift from kind of national trends and setting of political pressure, and I mean this is in the we're noting the financial context. This is in the context of government cuts for many years to local government, diminishing our funding completely. And I suppose my question is, has there been other areas of success where the council's been able to lobby central government for funding in specific things that would enable us to be in a better financial position in the years ahead?
I think the clearest example of where new funding has been coming into the system in recent years is probably around social care. So in the last couple of budget setting cycles, we've effectively seen towards the back end of the budgeting process, following the Chancellor's budget in November, say October-November time, we will get an announcement whereby there is In our own case last year, it was just under £3 million of additional funding for social care. So I think that's a sign of that broader sort of lobbying effort from across local government and bodies like the LGA, sort of in terms of identifying those areas where you can clearly identify growing demand that perhaps the funding system as it was set up wasn't quite addressing. Hopefully, I don't know if that's specific a response, but I'll
Okay.
So kind of looking at a better financial position in the future, in the process that you discussed in terms of how decisions are made in terms of finance, there's point D on page 75 talks about preventing demand, and you cite the supported living investment in early intervention. And so obviously there's been some political decisions made locally where early intervention preventive services have been cut over the previous years because of budget cuts from government. I'm just wondering what weighting factor is there beyond kind of the procurement and systems changing, where analysis is done to see where, for example, in social care, we could introduce new services for early intervention and prevention or refund youth services or children's centres that have been cut in order to save funds in the future. How much weighting is placed on that?
So in terms of the development of specific budget proposals, so in this budget cycle and going back into recent years, we will look at any proposals holistically. So in terms of where we have services, where they have an early intervention, they have a preventative role, we would be when you're looking at what we'd be investing in that service, we'd also be looking at and what would the impact be on the demand-led budget. So something like the investment in supported living programme, if we can provide more of the kind of support that lets people remain in their own homes, it means that there are the less residential placements going forward, which arguably there's benefits for both the individuals involved, but also it happens to be a lower cost result. So I think we do see it in developing every budget proposal. We will be looking at both sides in terms of what we're spending on prevention and what the sort of the end product, what we're spending on a more responsive expenditure item later on. I don't think we have I couldn't really point to examples of where we've done things which aren't efficiency savings within the preventative budgets from my recollections of looking back in recent budget setting cycles. So I'd struggle in terms of that bit with a response.
Thank you, Councillor Tuckwell.
Thank you, Chair. Just the housing revenue account, just 56 million. It says here that it's being reinvested in maintenance, improvement, and expansion. I was wondering if you could just talk us through that. Thank you.
Yes, I've got, thank you, Councillor. Yes, so the housing revenue account, the council has approximately 10,000 homes which are available for social and affordable rents. That £56 million of rents that we bring in every year is effectively being recycled to keep those houses up to spec, and also gives us scope to expand the housing stock. I believe, I'm just looking at the report just to check I don't contradict it, but I believe we have something like 400, just over 400 new dwellings built in terms of construction going into the capital programme going forward over the next 4 to 5 year period. So I think so I think that effectively shows we've got a HRA which is sustainable in the longer term. We can see that as a financial model. We can continue to invest in social housing and provide it for the foreseeable future.
Thank you, Councillor Tuckwell. Do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, just on the looking back at, I remember having this. I was new to this committee this time last year, but I remember very clearly it's a very similar conversation. And if we look back, we can see, and I think you said earlier on, a lot of the savings are predicated on service transformation. And we can see clearly here how that's delivered for us over since 2015. That's delivered for us, and without major impact, and in some cases improvement in council services, I think needs to be congratulated. to everybody. So again, we're sitting here looking at service transformation, and I have every confidence that we'll be able to deliver on that. So no, that's all I wanted to add to that.
Councillor Markham.
Thank you, Chairman. I just want to say thank you very much for this report, and I'm delighted to see we are continuing to have strong financial management whilst we are putting our residents first. Thank you.
I assume there's no follow-up on that one. Mr. Little.
Thank you. Can I return again to the subject of the high needs spending, the SEND spending? You talk about the deficit recovery plan, and you talk about the redistribution of individual school balances. Can you give any further details as to the scale of that and how it will work in practical terms?
So, Schools Forum have obviously looked at this in a lot of detail, and I should just add to what Ian said, that the deficit recovery plan that's been presented to the DfE for Hillingdon's schools budget has been jointly agreed with the Schools Forum and the council, so it's been a partnership approach, and that plan sets out a whole range of activities, things that we can do proactively, pragmatically, which includes the option to look at how a small number of schools have very large balances, which in its totality completely outweigh the deficit that the Schools Forum are facing. So I think and this is off the top of my head from memory, I think it's of the order of about 42 million in reserves are held in schools, and they're concentrated in a small number of schools. So, I mean, clearly there are not powers at local authority or Schools Forum level to redistribute the wealth, but it is something that will be actively explored, and as Ian has said, that it's been made very clear that were those options available to Schools Forum, that would have been done by now. But it's not a done deal, and it actually isn't straightforward, but it will be something that Schools Forum and the local authority will look at.
Thank you. Mr. Little, do you have a follow-up?
Do we have an idea on the timescale of that?
To some extent, it will depend upon the response that we receive from the Department for Education.
Thank you very much, Councillor Sweetin.
Thank you, Chair. In the past, reports to Cabinet have identified only a very small number of schools that are in deficit. But I am hearing from governing bodies that I have connections with that the pattern is changing. Could you give an idea of how many schools are likely to be in deficit? Because I've been hearing that some of the reasons for the deficit is because the schools are having to accommodate SEND or SEN children, where the budget for those children is not sufficient to meet the needs for those children. And in fact, one school that's never been in deficit before is going in deficit purely because of SEN children.
Dan or Ian?
No, so I was going to say, so I don't have to hand how many schools are projecting a deficit position going forward. We do have, I don't know if you've seen it, but the Cabinet papers for next week's meeting have got a sort of a first look at the budget monitoring for the new year. I suppose, yes, all I was going to say is if it's not something like sort of Dan's feedback on just now, if the content in the Cabinet report doesn't pick up on some of those things, then we can deal with a query. We'll deal with a query if that's way.
Thank you. Dan, did you want to say anything?
Just to add and echo what Ian said, we can certainly provide the committee with information on the exact detail. But I think it is fair to say that the number of schools who are experiencing a deficit budget is growing. We don't, to some extent, there is a little bit of a time lag because academy schools publish their accounts, as it were, much later, end of August time from onwards. And so what we do have is the best information available. We can certainly provide that to you.
Thank you. I have no other members indicating they wish to speak or ask questions. Are we happy to bring this to a close now?
Agreed.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Ian, for your attendance. You can leave when you wish to do so. Item 8 is our quarterly school places planning update, pages 79 to 82. Dan and Sarah, welcome to you both, and thank you for your patience. And when you're ready to give your presentation, please feel free to do so.
Thank you, Chairman. So this is the regular quarterly school place planning report, so hopefully there'll be no major surprises for the committee. If I could start with primary places, I mean, and probably first thing, important thing to say is that, and we echoed this previously, Sarah and I, when we attended the committee, that all children who will be starting in September have all been offered a place. That's no issue across both primary and secondary. At primary, and as previously reported, we are starting to see the demand plateau, and in some areas it's starting to drop. And certainly certainly since the last time we reported to committee, Sarah has been actively speaking to heads and governing bodies in certain schools to establish what their plans are and what their intentions are. And we've been therefore exploring, and some schools have been exploring in a coordinated way the option to reduce their published admission number and the option to put in place temporary caps, so which help to kind of manage some of the challenges. And in particular, it's a very pragmatic management action. That it means then that what schools are aiming to do is to try to keep class sizes in multiples of 30 ideally, and that's important because obviously that if you spill out into the next class by another 10 pupils, you've got to employ another whole teacher, and that in terms of the income that you get per child, that can be lower per child per class. So we've been exploring all of that with primaries, and Sarah's putting that together into a report for members as soon as we've completed the school places planning update on the forecast, which is due back to the Department for Education at the end of next week. So running into late July, early August, we'll be polishing off that report and making that available to members. In terms of secondary school places, we have seen, as predicted, an increase in demand for secondary school places for September 19. I'm pleased to report, as we have done previously, all children who applied for a school place have been offered a school place. It is a tight position, as the report sets out. There are just a handful of schools in which there are spare places. Many of them are concentrated in the Harefield Academy at this point in time. Excuse me. But we're confident that all children will be offered a school place, even the in-year admissions. In terms of the forward plan for secondary school places, as I mentioned a moment ago, we are finalising our forecast which is an annual refresh using the latest population data and the latest migration and housing development information. That will be ready by the end of next week, and then we'll be able to just polish up our forecast, our briefing for members, and I'll be reporting back to cabinet members on what the position is and what the plan is and the options are for meeting that need going forward. Which of course, which we still have in place, is the free school option in the north of the borough, which is a sixth form entry secondary free school to meet need. Thank you. Welcome any questions.
Thank you very much. Are there any members wishing to ask questions? Councillor Swain.
Thank you, Chair. Can you give us more details about exactly where the primary education planning areas are that are having reductions contemplated for their planned admission numbers?
Yes, interestingly, it's right through the borough. So there's one of the areas where there's a reduction in number of children appearing is up in Northwood, and what we're seeing is there are most of the reasons seem to be linked to housing. In some areas they're due to the fact that people are staying put in either owner-occupied housing or in social rented housing, and they're staying in it after their children went to school. Several head teachers say, I can look out the door and I can see all these ex-parents, but they're still living there and there are now no children there. I can only hope their grandchildren will move in with them. So So up in the north, in Northwood, there's in the hills up there on the border. That's one area. Then around the edge of Uxbridge into North Hillingdon, there's quite a lot. And the schools are very clear that that's about people moving away because of the cost of private rented accommodation in the main, and sometimes a little bit some Eastern European families moving out, but mainly about the price of rented accommodation. And although the housing all looks the same, more of it has become privately rented, and there have been London-wide reports saying that private rents in this borough in northwest London have gone up more than the London rate, so it's just not as cheap as it used to be. And then also along just north of the M4, that's another area where perhaps what we're seeing there is that some of the housing rent costs are quite high because it's sought after by those adults who work in Hayes or Heathrow, and many families choose not to live near the motorway or Heathrow, and so but it's very much going across the borough, and there's this mix, as I said before, that more than half of the primary schools are utterly full, and that makes a problem because we do have to have spaces for parents all across the borough, but you don't want there to be too many spaces. And it is this issue of the tightness of the annual budget that at a London-wide meeting someone was saying a two-form entry school can't really afford more than one class that goes below 25 pupils. They need them. So now most of our schools have got 3 classes in a year group, so they're taking in 90. But if they end up with a year group, which a few of them have, of 70 to 80, then they start having classes that are going under, and several of them in several year groups. And it's quite a high cost, because then the school budget sort of just allocates according to the number of pupils on roll and assumes the school can fill them in groups of 30, but they can't if they fall in different year groups. And so some schools have got, several of, very few schools, we're talking about 8 schools that are particularly hit, but they've got more than 4 teachers more really than their budget is paying them for, because they're spread out over more classes. Teacher and a teaching assistant, if they're infant, the price, the cost of those vary. It depends on whether they're experienced teachers, cheap agency staff, or expensive, and so on. But some schools are saying it's £200,000 gap in a year, and that's probably what you're also hearing, is that those schools are schools that said we never thought we'd run out of our reserves, but another year of this, we just can't have that. So it is a DSG related issue now, that the DSG is paying for a few million to basically fund empty-ish classes, and the children aren't even benefiting from being in the small classes because the schools are so nervous. They're not always they're sometimes employing temporary staff, and then some children at worst. There's several schools where at one point in the year there've been 2 classes, then extra kids have come in, and you don't just open a class for the other 2 that take you over. You have to reset all of them into 3 classes. So you've got 70, 80 pupils being rejigged between teachers. And then at worst, the next year it goes down again. And so some of them have changed 3 times in 2 years. So it is actually affecting pupils' experience in a very few schools, and I would urge action, yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Swain, do you have a follow-up?
Well, I'd just like to emphasise that for some schools it's almost like a perfect storm. You know, there's been extra places put in, new buildings, etc., that the youngsters have not locked up, and they're having turbulence all the time, and I just don't know what we as a council can do about it. I realise that the reductions in PAN, you know, the unofficial, if you like, reductions in PAN is one way forward, but I think there will be a time where they're not, that we will have to think very, very seriously about asking schools whether they want a permanent reduction in their planned admission number, because some are just saying to me, coming to me, in my area anyway, we can only see a couple of years before, I won't say fall off the cliff, but our budgets become very, very difficult.
Dan?
So what can we do for council, please?
Certainly, I think it's acknowledged that certainly the housing market has contributed to some of the changes that, you know, decisions that families have made to either stay or move, and, you know, changes to the national welfare system where which has meant that there's been benefit caps or restrictions, has also then meant families have made decisions about where they live. And so there is that volatility, and obviously, you know, this is a longer term sort of picture. The ability of households to raise mortgages and buy their own property has meant that more have now found themselves renting, and therefore that changes the nature of the housing market. So it does become a more transient sort of picture, which obviously in terms of meeting school place planning needs, it becomes quite challenging. I think in terms of sort of practical action that can be taken, certainly the two actions that we're looking to explore and recommend to members, the concept of the cap, where you put in place, we'll try to manage that in year, is a way of doing that, and as Councillor Sweeting said, a permanent change to a reduction in published admission numbers obviously helps to permanently put in place that change, and they're the practical things that we can do.
Thank you very much. Councillor Tuckwell?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Again, listening to the debate, and I have to say, you know, job well done, I think, for the September intake. I know we're not quite there yet, there's a few loose ends, but again, it amazes me, you know, how many elements need to be taken into account: housing, population, you know, all the shifting sands that you guys have to put up with. So well done for that. My question is, where we've got schools on the boundary, the council's, the borough's boundary, how do we work with other local authorities to sort of mitigate the impact or take account the impact for what that could have on schools that are on our boundaries?
Thank you, Councillor Tuckwell. So, I mean, in terms of London working, what we have in London is what we call a sort of pan-London admissions arrangement. So when it comes to offering school places, there is a timetable that all London boroughs work to. Now, being on the edge of London, obviously we've got the interface with other non-London boroughs, but generally speaking, they broadly work to the same timetable. So if we're looking at schools which are on the boundaries, there is a coordination. So we know basically how many offers or how many applications and offers will be made for our schools, and likewise for children living in our borough who then also maybe live close to that boundary and who are looking for a place in a school just outside Hillingdon. In terms of, I suppose, trying to manage that, we've got you can't really, because basically there's previous case law on this, and local authorities can't put that kind of artificial wall around all their schools and saying they're our places for our children. So that, in other words, parents have the choice. But what we do try and do is try and understand and factor that into our forecasting. So typically there will be some schools, primary and secondary, on our borders in our borough, which will be, I know for a fact that about 40 to 50% will be taken up by children living outside our borough.
Thank you, Councillor Tuckwell. Do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, just on that, are those neighbouring boroughs, and I think London boroughs mainly, are we seeing similar sort of trends in terms of profiling of admissions?
It's interesting. Certainly, I know Sarah's been to a number of sort of pan-London admissions arrangements. Certainly, primary is a very similar pattern, What I would say in terms of secondary, though, in terms of some of the inner London boroughs, and do jump in if I've got this wrong, Sarah, that they're seeing less of a growth, and it tends to be like the outer London boroughs who are seeing the secondaries grow, which it's almost like that wave outwards, I suppose. But given that we're geographically quite a large borough, the volume of children will be higher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Little.
Thank you. Two questions, one primary, one secondary, and a comment on the deficits that I would want to back up Councillor Sweeting's feelings about deficits, and perhaps some of them are being managed in a way that isn't the best for the schools in the longer term. In relation to the primaries, can you say a little bit about the strategy you're going to take when you're deciding which ones get the reduction in the PAN, or on a temporary or a permanent basis? Is it going to be towards choking off demand in some so that others benefit, or is it going to be by mutual cooperation, or are there competitive forces? And in relation to the secondaries, are we in danger of repeating the same problem? That is, we're dealing with a current shortage, which will soon turn into a current surplus, and maybe quicker than we thought because of the same pressures that we've seen in the primary level.
Okay, on primary, PAN reduction is more complicated than... It's very easy for any school admissions authority, the Council for Community Schools and the governors for the academies and the VA, to decide to increase over their number. I mean, it's not quite as simple for us to persuade some of the secondaries to do so, but we have done this year. But the whole process is aimed at keeping a high number of places, because it was all designed when roles were rising. So the legal structure makes it hard to reduce PANs, and also you're taking away parental choice. So what I did was looked at all the schools that said they were upset. I looked at all the data to see the ones where the rolls had been low for a while and below their current PAN, and looked at what case we would have to make, either the local authority making the case for the community schools or the governing bodies of the academies, who would have to have the support of the local authority. So I was going to check and say whether we'd support it, if you like, because normally we've opposed. And it became clear that you've got to prove that the roll has been low for a few years, that it's been below the PAN, and also that the number of first preferences has been low, which shows that no parent who would the previous couple of years have wanted to go would be, as an example. And actually that came out with these 8 schools that we've come out with. It's true that some others were hopeful, I think, that they could have made a case, but some of them have been more popular in recent years, so we wouldn't have won the case, they wouldn't have won the case. So it's actually been based on the semi-legal process, the evidence that we have to provide, and it's there, we think, for the 8 schools. There's 2 where we need to double check in September to make sure exactly how many pupils do turn up, because it's relatively close. But it's absolutely transparent and will be set out in the autumn to everyone. But it is absolutely transparent. There's no. But yes, as a byproduct of sorting out those 8 that have found themselves with the big pockets, it will even out for some of the others nearby as a byproduct.
In terms of secondary, we're considering all options available. So, and for some areas, some parts of the borough, it may be that we need 2 or 3 years of bulk year classes. That can be that may become accommodated through existing schools. For others, the demand is such that we're looking at now, based on the current forecast, that the free school would continue to be required. So we're looking at all options in terms of how we can meet the need with secondary places, and that will be reported to members.
Thank you. Councillor Swain.
Yes, I'd like to come back to secondary places, and I have real concerns about the secondary, the amount of unfilled capacity that we've got in the secondary sector, and the fact that Year 6 numbers are greater than the capacity that you've got in Year 7. So can you give me any idea of the detailed planning that's gone on to ensure that we have sufficiency of places? Because at the moment it would appear that there's really only one school, and that's in the very north of the borough, that's got any real numbers of unfilled places. So, could we just have some details of what's happening? Because my residents are saying, I think we're going to have problems getting our children into school for next September, not this September coming, but September 2020.
So we've looked at all sites across the borough, so we know where there could be bulgier classes. Conversations have started probably about 6-9 months ago with secondaries about how we can meet the need. And many secondaries are keen on trying to accommodate the extra pupils in their existing schools where that's possible. And of course, where it's not possible to meet the need, then we are looking at expansions to meet that particular need.
Councillor Sweet.
Thank you very much, Chair. Paragraph 20 of page 82 says about the new projections that are almost ready and waiting. Could we, as a committee, have copies of those projections, please?
That should be fine, yeah.
Okay. I'm aware time's marching on, so I will draw this to a close shortly. I will take two more from Councillor Mathers and Councillor Markham, and then we'll wrap it up. So, Councillor Mathers.
Thank you. I'm intrigued as to the impact on the quality of education when we put in mitigations or workarounds in terms of either like bulge classes and the impact that can have on educational attainment, etc. And equally, when, like you mentioned, that there are some primary schools, for example, who may be hesitant to commit to teachers, so therefore provide temporary solutions, and just what, if any, influence we can have, and I know this may move slightly beyond admission, but as a local authority to ensure that schools are making the right decisions for their students, as opposed to just ones that are financially viable, despite, as we know, the great pressure.
I mean, thank you for the question. I mean, certainly in terms of our sort of school improvement responsibilities, all schools' results, attainment, progress, attendance, etc., gets closely monitored by the local authority. Obviously, with academy schools, they're autonomous, independent, but in a number of schools, and we work closely with a number of heads and attend regular meetings with heads, and we have conversations about progress, attainment, but also the challenges that they're facing. And most are very innovative about how they work together collaboratively to share ideas, to share developments. And many schools are involved in sort of peer reviews where they review each other. So they're actually a very strong community in terms of working together. And what I would say as well is that many of the arrangements that are in place in schools, such as lesson observations and mentoring and buddying, etc., work very well. And so they do provide the classroom teacher and the senior leaders and the middle leaders in school with a lot of support.
Thank you, Councillor Mathers.
I also wondered if so the first preferences are predominantly met and people are getting their preference over the 6 options. But I wonder actually if you started to see a rise in concern from parents pre-application who are voicing concerns around the opportunity, particularly in secondary, to get into a certain secondary school, or if it is just business as usual. There's been no particular spike in complaints or concerns from parents looking ahead.
Not particularly. I mean, I think it is pretty much business as usual. I mean, the really popular schools continue to be oversubscribed, and for those schools, they receive lots of appeals. But we always, through the admissions process, we always make very clear that it's important that parents do list their full 6 preferences, so that they've got the best chance of being offered a school place of their choice.
Thank you. Councillor Markham?
Thank you. I mean, it's a very complex issue. I mean, this is a quarterly report, and every quarter we seem to raise the same issues, the same questions. And so much of it is out of our control. There's obviously zilcho that we as a council can do. I am reassured, Sarah, and I'm naming you, that you actually keep your eye on the ball, because no matter what questions we throw at you, you are at least aware, and so are you, Dan. And it seems to me that's all that we can expect. There are all these big issues, local as well as regional as well as national. But the key thing is to make sure that you two and the team that you work with are aware of all these issues and that you can react very quickly. So I think, cool, well done.
Thank you very much, and that's nicely wrapped up, Councillor Markham. Thank you for your attendance, Dan and Sarah, and you're also free to go whenever you wish to do so. Item 9 is our scoping report into tackling littering and fly tipping within Hillingdon, pages 83 to 98. First of all, my thanks to you, Neil, for typing up a very well-detailed report. Would you care to say anything?
So, with your permission, Chairman, Councillor Sweeting very kindly pointed out that I'd made an error in this. So you'll notice within the schedule for prospective witness sessions, I have listed January 2019 and February 2019, which of course should be 2020. Sorry.
Thank you for the clarification. Are there any comments from members, or are we happy to adopt the scoping report? Councillor Sweeting, start.
Thank you, Chair. We did talk about it, including waste services and civic amenity capacity as well, and I was wondering whether we could put that as the 9th item on page 86, so to consider waste services and the current and future civic amenity capacity in the light of the withdrawal of the planning application regarding the coal yard site in Useley Ward, and that was just withdrawn on the 15th of this month.
Thank you. I have discussed this with officers outside of the meeting in regards to review, and I do feel that making the scoping report too broad wouldn't do us any favours as a POC, and I do believe that what we have in front of us is sufficient enough to look into actual littering and fly tipping. I don't think there'll be any benefits in visiting the actual sites themselves, that is back office staff and etc. What we're actually focusing on is littering and fly tipping on street level. So it is my view that is left out, but I'm happy to take the lead from the committee. I know there's people indicating wishing to speak. Councillor Markham?
Yeah, no, I'm happy with that one. I mean, we are talking about fly tipping, we're not talking about waste management. And inevitably, like with all these reviews, as time goes on, as we have the witnesses coming in and different organisations, other questions, will arise, which may sort of move us away at some time, but still not losing sight of what we're here to talk about.
Thank you. Councillor Tuckwell?
Yes, through you, Chair. Yeah, I agree. I think we're going to be pretty much looking at the antisocial element of fly tipping and littering. That's pretty much what happens out on the street. No doubt we will get some insight, because I think waste services will be part of the witness group that present to us. But I agree. I think we should leave it as it is and not broaden it any further.
Councillor Mathers?
I'm going to respectfully disagree, if I may, just because I think there is sometimes a correlation between people's ability to discard of their waste through civic amenity particularly, and the increases in fly tipping, geographical constraints to that. And I think it would be useful as part of this review to hear a plethora of councillors, yes, across our views and other colleagues, but also to get views from the public. And if there are a way to really find out what their views are in terms of all of the challenge of fly tipping, their solutions to fly tipping, but also just their belief in the accessibility to discard of waste in a sensible and helpful way.
Okay, So that will be coming up in the scope. Just one thing I did mention to you, Neil, actually, outside the meeting, was the potential witnesses was street champions, who do play a vital role in reporting issues around the borough. I do think there's a benefit in actually having those as potential witnesses if they were willing to come forward. Councillor Kaufman.
Thank you, Chairman. I agree with several of my colleagues that this is an extremely good scoping report, and I don't think it needs anything added to it. The only thing I would suggest is that you're looking at street champions. You might also like to look at some of the litter picking groups that we have across the borough, which are doing an extremely good job, and if we could get this strategically done, it would help our waste services tremendously in clearing street litter. So thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Swain.
Sorry, Chair. I was just going to repeat that I think residents should be involved in their point of view, and although street champions are going to be very welcome, there are quite a few people that are not street champions that have got their own stories to tell, and I don't think we should just discard them because they have their own solutions, and they may well be very welcome to this committee to consider.
So I sort of had Neil whispering in my ear. If we do have suggestions in addition to the witnesses that have listed, perhaps you could put them to Neil and he can take it offline and speak to the relevant officers.
Yeah, so just to reiterate, any suggestions, all welcome for consideration as witnesses.
Councillor Vardia.
Thank you, Chairman. I thought Appendix A was particularly interesting, where the statistics for fly tipping in Hillingdon were compared to the other boroughs. So we're very, very good, clearly, at issuing fixed penalty notices. But despite that, our fly tipping, I must admit, was higher than what I had perceived it to be. And last time we discussed this, I was a little bit sceptical. But having seen the statistics, I do welcome us looking into this issue. So, for example, Barking, Barnet, Bexley, Bromley, Lambeth, Lewisham, Wandsworth all have lower reported incidents. And it does beg the question how, ultimately, I'm sure fixed penalty notices help us raise money, but I think what would be of most financial and environmental benefit to our residents would be actually tackling the problem at its source. And I think we've got a list of areas to explore, and I would really like to see something about education added to that area. It would be good to see how other local authorities are tackling this issue, and perhaps if they are using more of an educational type approach to prevent fly tipping from happening in the first place. We're talking so much, everywhere you go, there's talk of the environment, pollution, littering, plastics, and I just am when you look at the actual statistics, it is astounding, and I would like to see more of a focus on education, just because I think we should just try every single approach to try and get on top of this problem.
I think with item 2 on page 86 under the terms of reference, to understand why individuals and businesses choose to be antisocial and fly tip could be part of the sort of education remit that you're referring to, and indeed the appendix that you mentioned as well. I don't think you was present at the meeting, but it was a while back, I recall, when we had ASBIT in front of us for a witness session, and we looked at the stats in detail. Firstly, a lot of the stats that you see for them are probably high street related and not necessarily ward related, when we had the full breakdown at a later date, which is what we found out as a POC. So that was one interesting thing that came out of it, but also the great work that our waste services do in actually preventing a lot of these numbers being higher than they currently are, because it could be an awful lot higher if our waste services hadn't intervened at an earlier moment before the investigation team did. So this will be part of the review, and it will be interesting to see how this develops. Councillor Tuckwell?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just everybody seems to be referring to Appendix A, but there's one number that stands out for me, and that's Brent's 253 prosecutions. Yeah. And it could be that we might want to go and talk to our friends in Brent and understand if that's a real 253 or if it's but lessons to be learned, I think. So, but that was one number that stood out for me.
Councillor Mathers?
If I may, just a quick point. In terms of witnesses from potentially the private sector or certain organisations, I'd be really keen to draw in those experts who have kind of a broader subject knowledge rather than necessarily certain product knowledge. I think it was very useful for the last review to have product knowledge because of the current systems we have. But actually, if we want to be as innovative as possible, it would be useful to get someone who's not particularly attached to a certain product, but can say, actually, this is used here, and that's used there, and that's used there. Thank you.
So do you mean from an enforcement perspective?
I was thinking more just kind of preventative measures. So the technologies that might be available, the different innovations that other, not just local authorities, but I suppose, I try not to use certain company names, but I suppose in my mind, rather than just saying, we've got this solution that you could add to your current systems, someone else who maybe knows that solution, but also has seen knowledge elsewhere, and someone else has seen knowledge elsewhere can come and say, these are the options available. That's always going to happen at some point. These are the options available. So we can get a broad idea.
Okay. Yep.
Do my best.
Are there any other members? No, none on my left. Okay. Councillor Mark?
Yes. I just wanted to pick up what Chairman was saying about the public, and I think it's useful for those who may be watching that every single council committee report can be accessed from the council's website, and that the public are always welcome to attend any of our meetings, and indeed to comment on the reports and the actions and the decisions that we take. So the many hundreds of people who are no doubt watching us, should not feel, thousands of people, but should not be afeared that we do welcome public comments.
It is actually within the responsibility of this POC, if we choose to do so. We can use additional resources such as surveys for the members of the public, if we was minded to do so. So whether that's a survey to street champions or members of the public more broadly, that is at our disposal as a POC, so that might be something we could also look at to get public engagement. Are we happy to note this other than that? Okay, thank you very much. Item 10 is our Cabinet Forward Plan, pages 99 to 104. Are there any questions or comments? Councillor Swain?
It's just my usual question of when is the report on new services going to go to Cabinet?
I'm not aware that it's got a date as yet, Councillor. So once it's published on the forward plan, I will make it available to the committee.
Okay. Can we note that? Thank you. Item 11 is our work programme. Comments? Councillor Swain?
Thank you very much, Chair. You will see that added to our work programme in the October meeting, there is an item, a one-off business item, which is SEN service provision. Now, you may remember, if we look at the minutes on page 3, there were two elements to that. One was dealing with our current SEND capacity and future increases in that, which is, I know that there is an issue of the lack of SEND places, and I think Hillingdon is looking at that, but also the impact on schools in respect to the increased numbers of SEN and SEND children, especially budgets and the way that the Education, Health and Care Plan delivery is happening. So I'm just saying, are both of those areas going to be covered by that one information report?
Sorry, Neil.
Yes, I fed that back to the report author, and I would hope that both of those will be covered in the report.
Thank you. There's no other members indicating. Sorry, Neil, go ahead.
I should also point out, Chairman and the committee, there was a request for an item on youth service to be brought forward.
Oh, yes.
I have put that to officers. It took some time to get an answer, so apologies I haven't fed it back previously, but I can say that has been agreed to be brought forward to the January meeting now, so it will be ahead of when the budget is considered at Cabinet.
Thank you. With there being no other questions or comments, we'll note that, and that concludes our business for this evening. My thanks to you all for your attendance, and have a safe journey home. Good night.